My name is Dr. Daniel H., and I'm an associate professor with the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University. I'm also president of the Confederation of University Faculty Associations, BC. Our 5,500 members across the province in higher education, academic librarians, academic faculty, university professors, instructors, and other academic staff at the 5 research universities in the province: Simon Fraser University, University of British Columbia, University of Northern British Columbia, University of Victoria, and Royal Roads. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that the land on which Kufa BC's office is situated is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. We acknowledge our traditional hosts and are grateful to be able to carry out our work on their land. In doing so, we recognize the inherent Indigenous rights and title, the implementation without qualification of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and our support for the 94 calls for action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Please take a moment to reflect on the nations on whose land you're living and working, and from where you're joining us today. We are here today to present the winners of the Kufa 2020 BC Distinguished Academics Award. Each year since 1999, Kufa BC honors the outstanding scholarship and public policy contributions of our distinguished academics. Academics whose research and scholarly activity here has made significant contributions to the non-academic community. At Kufa BC, we believe that the ideas that flow from our universities are the lifeblood of our citizenry and our democratic landscape, our intellectual life, and our economy. The Kufa BC Distinguished Academic Awards celebrate the ideas that contribute to the non-academic community and demonstrate the necessity and vitality of public, university-based research and scholarly activity. Each year, our winners hail from different institutions and disciplines and conduct research in a variety of fields. However different their work, they are united by their passion for rigorous and meaningful scholarship and for research that contributes to the public good. I am pleased to present the winner of the 2020 Kufa BC Buttedahl Career Achievement Award. This award goes to Dr. Ken Lertzman. The Career Academic Achievement is named in memoriam for Dr. Buttedahl, an academic, community builder, and faculty association leader. The award recognizes contributions to the community beyond the academy through research or other scholarly activities throughout one's career. This award brings with it the due recognition of a lifetime of research dedicated to pursuit of knowledge and truth, advocacy, and building community and relationships. In addition to the admiration of one's colleagues, the award is recognized through a commemorative plaque and a cash award. Dr. Lertzman is Professor Emeritus in the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University. Dr. Lertzman formally began his tenure in 1991, and he joins us to talk about his research. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like you to perhaps start by talking about your research interests and some of the highlights over your career. It's been a long and distinguished career, so this isn't a short answer. But if you could summarize your interests and highlights, I'd appreciate it.
I started out as an ecologist. I was started in basic science. I was interested in understanding the world around me, and kind of began my career sort of as an animal ecologist. By the time I finished graduate school, I had shifted to forests. I was interested in systems. I was interested in ecosystems, how animal and plant communities worked. And one of the main, that's really been a consistent theme throughout my career, trying to understand, in this case, how forests worked. In a lot of cases, I was really interested in trying to understand, how do forests work when there aren't people there doing things to them? How do forests grow from being a young forest to an old forest? How do forest landscapes change in response to natural disturbances like fires, windstorms, floods? And when we go out into the landscape of British Columbia, one of the things that impresses people is the old spectacular forests. And I was interested in understanding, well, how do they get there? What processes maintain them? What processes shape them over centuries and sometimes millennia? while I initially was interested in kind of looking at forests in the absence of people, another big theme of my career has been trying to understand the place of people in forests. And that reflects both an interest in kind of modern forest practices, how we manage forests, the good things about it, the bad things about it. And I'd say one of the second big theme has been using what we can learn about how forests work to do a better job of conservation and management, whether it's management for forest products, whether it's management for wildlife habitat, management for conservation purposes. And as well, as I came to have a more nuanced understanding of the history of forest ecosystems, there are very few forests around the world that don't have a history of people being in them and shaping them over time, and that includes the forests of British Columbia. My wife is an archaeologist, and since the late 80s we've been working together, and so there's sort of for me, has been an important sub-theme of my research career, working with Daniel Lepofsky and various other people on issues at the intersection between people and forests, mainly indigenous people and forests, both in the past and in the present. And I've learned a tremendous amount from that aspect of things that has both changed and enriched my kind of core of being an ecologist. For the last 10 or 15 years, there's been an important theme of what I've been doing has looked at forest policy, kind of going from forest ecology to forest practices to people in the forest to forest policy, and especially the role of climate change in impacts on forest ecosystems, impacts on what people can do in forests, what people can expect from forests, how diverse ecosystem services that forests provide will be changing in the context of climate change, and what we can do to help forests continue to support the diverse services that we get from them. And as well, I'd say my interests have grown in spatial scales and temporal scales. I've been interested in long scales of time in this interaction between people and climate and forests, as well as looking at whole landscapes and going from looking at individual trees to looking at whole watershed ecosystems. As we talk, we can talk about some more of those details, but that's sort of the broad brush of my career.
Okay, that's fascinating, and I'm particularly intrigued in the transition you made from really focusing on forests to focusing on people to focusing on people and forests temporally over I would assume vast periods of time. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the really, I think, the findings of how that relationship has grown over time for our audience?
Sure. So when I was a grad student and was a PhD student, was first really studying forests, I was also very involved in environmental issues. Forest issues were a big deal at the time. And I very quickly realized that what I initially had seen as environmental problems also had a big social justice dimension, and that you couldn't really look at the environmental issues separately from their social context. And that was mainly in the context of the indigenous peoples who had been present for millennia on the landscapes that we were interested in from a conservation perspective. And my concept of the nature of the system that we were working with changed dramatically in response to that. And that has been there all along. There is a great depth of knowledge that comes from multi-generational presence on the land, and by living on the land, close to the land, you can learn things that are very different than we can as scientists by going in quickly and doing research. In fact, the knowledge bases are very complementary. As scientists, we can do things that are hard to do. We can learn things that are difficult to learn from presence on the landscape, and we have a lot to learn as well. In some ways, that's been I'd say, the most fun part of what I've done, and some of the most rewarding parts have been in efforts, conservation efforts, but not just conservation, but also working with the people who have been present on the land and have a lot to teach us about that. And that has many, many dimensions. From we used to think of indigenous peoples of the Northwest Coast as, called them hunter-gatherers. We didn't imagine that they had a role as managers and stewards of the land, but in fact we now know that they had a deep knowledge of how to interact with the ecosystems they participated in. They had incredible knowledge of many different kinds of management activities, whether that's use of fire to manage forests, intertidal root gardens, managing fisheries, growing, tending plants such as crabapple and things. There's a long history of interaction between people, and the ecosystems that European colonists found when they came here were ecosystems that had been shaped by the presence of people over millennia in many cases. And it's been really interesting to try and tease apart some of those ideas. And it brings you a view of ecosystems where ecosystems and people are not separate. They're people are part of ecosystems. And that has shaped my view of modern ideas about ecosystem-based management and our place in ecosystems going forward.
And I'm really interested in that, particularly with the intersection that you mentioned of climate change and going forward to address climate change and the intersection between the forests and people. So when you think in a forward-thinking manner, what are some of your thoughts on where this is going in the future?
So forests are a really interesting system to think about from that perspective. Forests store enormous amounts of carbon. Some of the biggest stocks of carbon storage in the world in the biosphere are in forests, and they play an important role in sequestering carbon. But they are exquisitely sensitive to climate. Not so much often in terms of the direct impacts of temperature and precipitation on the forest, but some of the big drivers of change in forests, like fires and floods and insects and diseases, are very sensitive to climate. And so we have seen in Western North America increases in the frequency of fire, in the severity of fire, in the kinds of ecological impacts that fires have. And so there's both a great opportunity in terms of thinking about human activities, what can we do in terms of both adaptation and mitigation of climate change. There are great opportunities in terms of forests, and there are also potential great threats. The importance of really good stewardship of our forests is only increased by changing climate.
And it's fascinating, the work that you're doing in what could be considered a very highly politicized environment, and yet you maintain a focus on public commitment and public value.
Yeah, it was an interesting evolution for me to try and define a role for myself as a scientist. I started working at SFU in '91. Clayoquot Sound, the summer protest was '93. I was a member of the scientific panel for sustainable forest practices in Clayoquot Sound from '93 to '95. I feel like my whole career has played out in the context of public discourse and disputes about the forests. And I really set a goal for myself to try and speak for what did we actually understand about forest ecosystems, and give the same message to no matter who I was talking to, whether it was the forest industry or the government, environmental groups, First Nations, and try and speak for the science in a context where politics and economics and social issues tend to dominate, But there's a real role, there's a critical role for actually understanding the nature of the systems, the ecosystems we're talking about. What is possible? What can we do? What are the tools we have to try and achieve that? And I take great pride in generally having been seen as someone who you could trust what I said, you could trust I wasn't going to go beyond the data, you could trust that I had reasons for any of the statements I was making, and that I would give a fair hearing to anybody who wanted to talk to me, irrespective of their political perspective or their role in the debates. And so I've been fortunate enough to work closely with really amazing people in the forest industry, with fantastic, committed environmental activists, with phenomenal people in First Nations, and some great people in government. It's easy. It's an issue where it's easy to demonize the people on the other side, and there's a lot of that's gone around. I have generally found that most people, most of the time, are doing the best job they can, given the information available. And there's a lot of opportunity to make change when everybody is interested in actually working together. And we've seen enormous changes from when I started in this business. We've seen enormous changes in the protected area system in the province. We've seen changes in forest policy and forest practices. And we've seen incredible changes in the recognition of the role of Indigenous communities in being able to assert their authority over their traditional territories and play a critical role in determining what kind of trajectories their territories will be on.
One of the important parts of, I think, as you highlighted, working with these diverse and multiple communities is bringing the truth as you understand it from the data that you've been able to collect to those groups. So science communication is really a core part of the work that you do.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. I've done a lot of talking to people outside the university, and it's not necessarily something that we get trained to do when we go through the system. My family jokes that I give 10-minute explanations to simple questions. I've had to work to learn to avoid jargon, try and capture the essence of an idea without providing all the gory detail that is so fascinating to us as researchers, but isn't necessarily necessary. And most of the time it works well. I mean, if you interact with people honestly and sincerely, there isn't much that you can't actually talk about with just about anybody.
Yeah, they may not like what you say, but they can trust that what you're saying with integrity.
Yeah, that's right. There's in Robert Heinlein's book Stranger in a Strange Land, he has these people they're called fair witnesses, and when I was a kid, that was an influential book for me. But I always had that idea, like, okay, but the role you really want to have here is a fair witness, that you'll stick with what you know, be clear when it's something that you have some uncertainty about, be clear if it's an opinion. I'm not afraid to let my values show through and let my opinion show through, but I'm clear to distinguish between what is a value, what is an opinion, and what we can actually base on evidence.
So you're an advocate of ecosystems and watershed management. Can you tell me about the Hakai Network for Coastal Peoples Ecosystems and Management and the Kwakshua watersheds?
Sure. So around 2008, I was finishing my term as director of the School of Resource and Environmental Management, and a fellow named Eric Peterson came to talk to me and said he'd purchased a remote fly-in fishing lodge on the central coast of BC that he wanted to turn into a research station, and was I interested in working with him to do that. We spent a lot of time talking. He is a remarkable guy, a real visionary, and has created something pretty amazing there. It's changed the nature of research in coastal British Columbia. And I'm pleased and proud to have been a part of helping make it happen. One of the things that the Tula Foundation, that he and his wife, Christina Monk, run, funded initially in that was a research network that was based out of SFU, the Hakai Network for Coastal Peoples, Ecosystems and Management, of which I was initially co-director and then director. And we were interested in working with the Indigenous communities on the Central Coast. A lot of my role there I described as being air traffic controller, finding researchers to match with important projects that needed to be done, both on the science end and the social science end, and making sure that things were happening. The part of it that then became closest to my own research was what grew into the Quaxua Watershed Ecosystems Project. The research station there is on a narrow channel in some outer coastal islands. It's like a lab rat for understanding these wet temperate rainforest watersheds and how they interact with the nearby ocean. And there's a large group of people that are part of this. I'd say that my biggest contribution was having the vision that to really understand the system, we needed everybody from plant ecologists and to soils people and geographers and hydrologists and biogeochemists and oceanographers to try and take a big picture look at how these ecosystems function. Yet in these remote areas, it's a hard thing to study. It's something that requires different disciplines with different kinds of skills, different analytical techniques. And it's hard to get there. It's expensive to get there. It's hard to work there. You need to get around by boat or by airplane. There's no trails, there's no roads. It's cold and wet and stormy in the winter. It's been remarkable. The Hakai Institute, now it's called, based there, has enabled a remarkable amount of research that has looked at these systems throughout the year, with research happening during the biggest storms of the year in the winter. And the kinds of things we've shown is that these big pulsed episodic events, the big storms, make a huge difference in structuring the ecology of how the forests and the streams and the nearby ocean are integrated. We've known for a long time, not from my work, from other work, that in the temperate rainforest, marine nitrogen is carried by the salmon up into the streams and then out into the forest by bears and wolves and birds. And that marine nitrogen is a huge subsidy to the growth of the coastal forests. What we're beginning to understand is that terrestrial carbon, the carbon that is fixed by the plants in the rainforest and is flushed by the rainfall into the soils and then into the streams and carried by the streams down to the ocean, that this terrestrial carbon also plays a big role in the nearshore marine environment. And this is true in many places around the world, but the coastal temperate rainforests, so the central coast of BC north through southeast Alaska, are really a global hotspot for the flow of terrestrial carbon into the marine environment. And for me, it's been very exciting to be part of this diverse team of people who are teasing apart different parts of this system, different parts of the problem, and starting to build some understanding of how it all fits back together.
I was really intrigued by just your explanation of salmon carrying nitrogen up the river and then the watersheds bringing carbon back to the ocean. Fascinating, interrelated outcomes from diverse fields.
I say it's one of the most exciting stories to come from research in this part of the world, in either the forest or the streams. And it shows when I grew up in academic ecology, the dominant idea was about competition and competition structuring, how ecological communities work. And in the 30 or 40 years since then, there has been a real shift to understanding the role of subsidies, like the salmon nitrogen story, the role of connections that support different species in different situations, the whole notion of connectedness in below ground ecosystems and forests has been transformational in how we see how forests work. And it's super exciting. It's a very different way of looking at the world around us.
It's almost impossible to summarize a career of knowledge in a 45-minute conversation. So thank you for sharing the depth and breadth of your work as much as possible. I know that you've also worked very closely with the Haida Gwaii in a 14-work program to deliver content to undergraduate students, more than 500 undergraduate students.
Yeah, this is something that since I guess around 2008 or so has been something I've been super excited about. So around 2008, I was contacted by some colleagues who have been long-time Haida Gwaii residents, and basically said that they were interested in putting together a program of university courses that would be run in Haida Gwaii, that would draw people from university students to come there to take these, but would also be available for local residents to give them a way to tap into post-secondary education without having to go down south, and would frankly be sort of an economic driver of the community during the winter when there isn't a lot of tourism there. They wanted something that would be community grown, would meet the needs of the community, as well as providing a rich and exciting opportunity for people coming from off island. And there are a lot of barriers to something like that happen. Universities offer university courses, not community groups. And we had a meeting of a few people, and I said, well, I have a graduate class in forestry that runs how and where I want to run it. How about if I offer my class as a sort of a test drive to see how this would work, and I'll bring it up this spring and we'll see what happens. And so that was the first trial run that they had done of working on a university class. It's a class that I had been running as a field class for about 12 years at that point, that has always been a super popular class, and has been like, it's an opportunity to get out with a bunch of students for a few weeks in the springtime and talk to people on the ground. It's a great chance to keep in touch with things. That was the best year that it had ever been. It was amazing to do this in partnership with a community group, to be in one community for the duration of the program. And what they started then evolved into the Haida Gwaii Higher Education Society, which is now accredited through UBC Faculty of Forestry, and is now the Hakai Institute, I believe they're calling it. And they run 2 semesters of courses. Students come up and take 5 courses in a semester that run as block classes. And just about every year since then, I've come up and done volunteer teaching in temperate rainforest ecology and management class that Andy McKinnon, formerly of the Ministry of Forests, now retired, and Sari Saunders, also with Ministry of Forests, were kind of the leads on, and Andy was the lead on that. And I always stole a week from my SFU teaching every spring to go up and teach in that. And it's been a great experience. Students love being there. It's been exciting to kind of dig deep in working with the community. It has had broad support from both the Haida and non-Haida communities up there, and has been supported by a huge amount of input from Ministry of Forests, Ministry of Environment, Parks, the local municipalities, Council Haida Nation, environmental groups, forest industry, and it's been a pretty amazing thing, and I'm very, very proud to have been part of it.
There's a real value to being able to deliver the type of education you're talking about in place,
yeah.
where you have the ability to study what it is that you're learning about, But there's also an ethical imperative to be able to deliver that kind of engagement in remote communities, in communities that wouldn't have access to that kind of learning in a traditional university model.
That's right. I think there is a real challenge to the university system in we've sort of had a one-size-fits-all kind of model where people have to come down south, they have to come to the city, they have to be a student more or less full-time most of the time. It's hard for people in remote communities to do that. It works for some people, but it doesn't work for a lot of people. And I think that maybe one of the good things to come from COVID is we'll find that we're not as scared as we used to be about finding ways to work remotely and work with people who are distributed in space and find ways to make that a rich experience.
Through your work, you've been working with Indigenous peoples in place, obviously for many years. How do you see your work intersecting with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations?
So I feel like for those of us who have been kind of working in this area for a long time, it was tremendously helpful to see the work of the TRC come out. It clarified expectations. It gave us names for things, gave us words to put on ideas. For me, they would have been growing in an informal way. And I think I actually went back and reread through their recommendations to try and think about how I would address this. And it seems to me that what I took from it, and that really the ideas that I had that coalesced around that, had to do with recognizing the Indigenous communities as people with a long-term commitment to place, long-term commitment to the interaction between culture and place that has evolved over time and is expressed today. And in our education system, in our legal and policy systems around use of resources, we tend to acknowledge things more than people. So as an example, when I was working on the scientific panel for sustainable forest practices in Clayoquot Sound, we found that archaeological sites, so the remains of ancient Indigenous people on the landscape, whether it was a rock shelter or rock art or a fishing site, archaeological sites had legal standing. They had they were recognized in policy. They were recognized in practices. If you found these things, you were supposed to protect them. But living Indigenous people didn't, right? There was the fact that a living person on the landscape today who held a lineage of names that was tied to a particular place on the landscape that made that place on the landscape sacred to them, that wasn't recognized in forest policy. The sacred place on the landscape that didn't have a physical manifestation in rocks and wood and that sort of thing didn't have a recognition. And so for me, a lot of this has been about trying to put the people back in their rightful place in the system. And if you look at the TRC recommendations about education, about healthcare, about the connections between culture and place, all of that is tied around recognizing people, recognizing the place of people, recognizing the rights of people, recognizing their connections back in time, connections across space to different communities, families, etc. And so for the last 15 or so years of my career, those kinds of issues have become much more on the front burner, whereas it was sort of context for me to look at ecosystems in the past. They really became my primary interests over in kind of the final years of my career. That drove the decisions we made in the Hakai network, that drove other projects that I've been working on. And I think it's important for people like me, people working in science, to work hard to try and understand that particular social context for the work that they're doing. If we're working in Indigenous territories, we need to understand and work in the context of the Indigenous people whose territories those are, and that has ramifications throughout what we do.
You know, as you talk, I think about the fact that BC is somewhat unique in not having a wealth of treaties with Indigenous nations that can help clarify working with the land and working with the various communities. Has that been a challenge for your work?
You know, I think I've worked with some groups who are in the treaty process. I've worked with other groups who have chosen not to be part of the treaty process, and you work with people where they are. And what I've done hasn't really changed much. I think treaty or other kinds of agreements are tools for those folks to use to achieve their goals. And so usually I work in ways that I'm being asked to work on, and to achieve goals that are driven internally by the community. And so it hasn't really been that much of an issue for me. I will add something about the salmon nitrogen story. The first I ever heard about that connection was it was in the Kitlope watershed, where I was part of a group of scientists brought in by Ecotrust Canada to work with the Haisla First Nation on protecting the Kitlope watershed, which is one of their core watersheds. It's an unbelievably beautiful wilderness watershed with a long history of people in it. And we were standing on this riverbank with these incredible giant Sitka spruces all around us. There was an elder standing there who looked at me and said, so you know why these trees are so big? I looked at him and said, tell me why they're so big. And he said, it's because the thousands of years of salmon coming up here and spawning and dying and fertilizing the forest. And about a year later, I started seeing the scientific papers coming out that were starting to document that story. But the understanding of that connection in the ecosystems had been part of the local and traditional knowledge of those people for a long time.
And it shows the power of story and in an educational context, but also in this context. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share your story with us and the story of your career. Is there anything else that you want to highlight for our viewers?
I think we're at an interesting time in terms of universities and the role of universities in society. The job has gotten harder as I've been here in my career. There's a lot more of a administrative burden put on faculty. There's a lot more overhead in maintaining the system that needs to be done. Most of it for good reasons, but what it's meant is that people are pushed in the system. It's harder to take the time to do a really good job of preparing your classes. It's harder to sit back and have time to think carefully about what you're doing in research. Everybody I know is scrambling to get grants, to keep their grad students funded, to find something new and exciting to do, to be able to follow their passions in their research. And I'm really curious to see what happens in the university system in terms of, because I don't think we can go a whole lot farther along the pathway that we've been going on in terms of that. And makes me realize that it was a luxury to have the time that we did, but that's still most of our, when we imagine what we really want to be doing, it's sort of the have time to be contemplative, have time to work closely with students, have time to take care of students when they need taken care of, and invest in them when they kind of, you can see that spark there that you want to nurture. And I think it's really important that we work hard to try and figure out how we can protect that aspect of it. And I'm frankly not really sure how we do that at this point, but it's got to be on the agenda.
I think it's critical. There was a book a few years ago, The Slow Scholar, which talks a lot about that, which is I think fascinating. And I think your comments are prescient, right? In the rush to productivity and efficiency and the focus on outcomes, we lose the individual story. And education and learning is really about the individual story.
That's
right back to your research of the individual story of the land, of the people on the land, and the people in our institutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you again for joining me today and talking about your work, Dr. Lertzman. I want to congratulate you again on being awarded the 2020 Kufa BC Buttedahl Award for Career Achievement as part of our annual Distinguished Academic Awards program. And I look forward to continuing to follow your work and support your interests in environmental stewardship.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.